Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Smythe, Executive Director of the Hippogriffs History Channel here in London, England. Here I am in front of a replica of the 1607 Godspeed that took the original 104 settlers from Great Britain to North America, thus creating the prelude to the United States of America. In this series of documentaries about antebellum United States, 1812 to 1861, I have the pleasure of introducing 14 distinguished scholars who are experts in this field of American history, all from some of the most prestigious universities in the world. In this episode, I'd like to introduce a distinguished scholar in the fields of American women and the suffragette movement, the Honorable Professor Atzidi Diaz, University in Providence, Rhode Island. Amongst her notable publications are The Importance of Women to American Society and Women's Roles in the Build-Up to the Civil War. I will now leave you in her capable hands to discuss life as a woman and child in the...
Welcome everyone to episode 4 in our series of documentaries about antebellum United States, 1812 to 1861. In the previous presentations, we discussed life as a northern factory owner, life as a northern factory worker, and life in the rural north. I am Professor Atzidi Diaz, a scholar of U.S. history at Brown University, and I am now going to discuss life as a woman and child. Women in the 19th century lived in a time when they were characterized by gender inequality. At the beginning of the century, women enjoyed the social, political, and legal rights that are now taken for granted in Western countries. Women did not have any power and could not make contracts, have their own property, could not sue or be sued, could not testify in court, had very limited control over their own property, and were barely ever able to be granted custody over their own children after a divorce, or were even able to vote against their husbands. This began to change by the 1830s and 1840s, when many bold women championed social reforms of prisons, war, alcohol, and even slavery. Yes, there was a difference in the roles of rich and poor women. Upper and middle class women usually remained at home, caring and being there for their children and running the whole household. Lower class women mostly worked outside, but poorly paid domestic servants or laborers worked in factories or mills. Through the first half of the 19th century, child labor was an essential part of the economy of the United States. Children worked on their own family farms and worked as servants for other people. But educational reformers during the mid-19th century tried to convince the public that a primary school education was a necessity if the Union were to go forward as a whole. Several states established a minimum wage for labor and requirements for school attendance, though there were many loopholes to these laws that were readily exploited by hungry employers for cheap labor. Boys began to gain apprenticeships around 10 and 14 to learn skilled trades such as carpentry, blacksmithing, and leatherworking. Boys were also expected to tend to the livestock, split firewood, repair tools, and even help run the family businesses. Some children even worked outside of their parents' property to make extra money for their families. Girls did not go outside of their houses nearly as much as boys did. Only some girls received an education and went to school. Some lucky girls who went to school had the option to attend a day school. If they didn't, they stayed home, cleaned the house, sewed, and cooked. And teenage girls even started looking for a husband as early as 15 or 16, but they actually delayed marriage until their early 20s. Their years of courtship were a time when girls became women and could have some freedom and power. Women during the antebellum period had a hard time with their independence and rights. Back in the 1868 presidential election, women couldn't vote, so 172 black and white women voted illegally to stand up for the women's suffrage movement. Now, nearly a century and a half later, in the 2020 presidential election, more women voted than men. 64.8% of women voted to 61% of men. Having the right to vote for women was a big thing because that was the main goal of the women's rights movement. Children made a valuable contribution to the United States economy. In the 1800s, most children worked on family farms, but increasing numbers moved into factories. During the Industrial Revolution, children had to work for long hours, usually 12 hours per day. The 1870 census showed that 1 in every 8 children were employed. This rate had increased to 1 in every 5 children being employed by 1900. Between 1890 and 1910, no less than 80% of all children between the ages of 10 and 15 were employed. Age was only one of the considerations while deciding if a child was ready to work, but nearly half of the children were injured by the heavy machinery. Children were paid just $2 for a 60-hour week. It wasn't until the early 1900s, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that child labor was banned in the United States. Women and children made a lasting effect on the United States during the antebellum period of its history. Women helped run the family household to allow men to work outside the family residence. Older children worked in the factories and on farms. Laws in the 20th century helped protect the abuse of women and children in the workplace.